Ah, perfect. So I will start now by just say a very warm welcome to all the participants coming today to this very last of our Civis Gender Studies Network online series. This is the last one for this academic year. And we are very pleased and excited to have Ralf Poole here. Ralf Poole is a professor of American Studies at the University of Salzburg. He worked before in Germany, Turkey, and the US. And I believe right now he's actually working on the Austrian Heimatfilm, but that's not what he's talking about today. Today, he's going to be talking about women in American studies, history of a discipline from a gender perspective. And with that, I would give the room to Ralf and to start his presentation. The presentation will be around 40 minutes long, and then we have the rest of the time for question and discussion. Okay, Ralf, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadine, for the introduction. Hello to all, and thanks for giving me the chance to participate in this lecture series. I'm trying to share my screen. Okay, that should be working. Okay, great. So in this talk, I want to provide an overview over the history of a particular academic discipline from a gendered perspective. I've chosen American studies as an example, of course, because it is my own field, but also because it may serve as an interesting and warning case study for how the history of a discipline can be successfully forged to eradicate women. Okay. American Studies is considered a young academic discipline. For example, Vernon Lewis Parrington and his 3-volume study, Main Currents in American Thought of 1928 is often cited as the founder or founding document of American Studies. This period of institutionalization, that is the 1920s, is what I learned when studying myself. That is what we can read over and over again. While not entirely denying this claim, I want to show that the history is longer than the official version of it, and that the part that is left out is the part where women held an important role in shaping the future of the discipline. Margaret Rossiter has called this the Matilda effect, a sex-linked phenomenon that is a systematic suppression of the contribution of female scientists to research and the frequent crediting of their work to their male colleagues. The reference is to what has been called the Matthew effect, which, referring to the biblical Matthew, claims an under-recognition of those who have little to start with. The Matilda effect, in turn, is named for the American suffragist Matilda Joslyn Gage, who in the late 19th century both experienced and articulated this phenomenon. In what follows, therefore, I want to recall the important and forgotten role of women in the history of American studies and recall their function as protagonists, as teachers, as researchers. A first look into standard overviews of American studies shows that in many I could not find no chapters on gender or even mention of gender as keyword, even though their titles suggest a new take on the field. So there's Rowe's New American Studies, Simmerlink's The New North American Studies, Hebel's Transnational American Studies, or Fluke's American Studies Today. Now, these studies include aspects of gender or women. For example, Maddox's Evolution of a Discipline has a chapter on women. Peace's Futures features an essay on queer topics. Radway's anthology has chapters on gender and labor, or gender and immigration, or even queer cyborgs. And Temperley's new introduction has at least one essay on American women. Also, these studies offer critical thinking about the discipline's history. For example, Renker writes about the first study courses in the field. She and Obermann look at structures of inequality, also Lodron and Shumway to some extent, and Harder's book, along with Renker's, is one of the few and very helpful studies specifically focusing on gender in relation to American studies. Especially given the lack of the inclusion of women in the history of the discipline, I want to go through the early phases of its development by doing just that, paying attention to women in that process. This will take me to my specific example, Mount Holyoke, a famous women's institution of higher education. Like I said before, American studies is a supposedly young discipline. Many authors even insist that it lacks a history of its own altogether. It is partly, but not only, due to the fact that the development of American studies has a lot to do with the development of the discipline as a teaching field, not a research field. And I'll be coming back to that point over and over again. This is a crucial point because it directly leads to the devaluation and elimination of women in the process of institutionalization. Also, in many institutional accounts, there is hardly any mention of structures of inequality, especially regarding race and class. So we may ask ourselves, why does it matter to include gender as a category when looking at the development of any discipline? Why when looking at American studies in particular? The underlying thesis of such questions is that gender, or the relations of genders, is central to the structuring of values of a society and has effects on sciences and its institutions. Also, when talking about gender in relation to the development of a discipline, we should remind ourselves that women have advanced from being objects of research to being protagonists of research. But there are still today structural inequalities, as we all know, such as notions of science and knowledge that are tied to masculinity and whiteness. A scientist is thought to be white and male. So I propose we can say that first, a discipline such as American studies is very much linked to a national culture, how a discipline imagines itself as dealing with nationhood. And second, such representations have an effect on the working conditions of female researchers and their production and reproduction of knowledge. That is to say, science has a gender. Joan Scott, a feminist historian, defines gender as a category for historical analysis as an essential element of social relations because it is based on real differences between men and women and because it comes into effect through power relations. We therefore need to look at first cultural and symbolic representations of gender, for example, seeing landscape as female. Second, for normative concepts, for example, women are relegated to the domestic sphere. We have to look at political and social institutions, for example, the representation of women in higher management. And at identities, for example, the assumption that men's identity is universal, but women's identity is female. What Scott is saying is that a history of a discipline from a gender perspective must critically look at the ways the discipline has looked at itself and the way it has produced blind spots. This then means, for my case, that female Americanists must be acknowledged. We have to ask, how has the discipline inscribed gender relations into its discipline? For this, we have to look at institutional structures, distribution of personnel, etc. We also have to look at outsiders of the discipline. Who are they? What have they contributed to the development of the field? We need to look at the communication structures of the discipline. For example, conferences, journals, who organizes them, who is included and excluded. We have to consider the ways that incentives are gendered. For example, who gets grants? Have there been mentoring programs for underprivileged persons? We have to look at American studies as a cultural practice that is looking at transfers to schools, museums, publishing houses, journalism, military, politics even. A gendered history of a discipline also needs to look at masculinity. That is, gender is not only about women. So, for example, what kind of male researcher was favored at specific times in history? What male authors were favored as research topic, and why? On a symbolic and theoretical level, this means asking, how has the discipline produced gendered notions of masculinity and femininity through canon, patrilineal narratives, scientific metaphors, and so on? And what about intersectional categories such as race, class, age, religion, region? Has there been any acknowledgement of more diverse identity categories during the early stages or later stages of institutionalization? Can we, for example, queer the field of American studies in hindsight? Before I get into the history of American studies proper, just some preliminary aspects of higher education in the US that are relevant for gender issues. Basically, higher education in the US is divided into two levels, undergraduate and graduate studies. Undergraduate education was adapted from the British model with the founding of Harvard College in 1636. Graduate studies developed in the 19th century and led to the distinction of colleges and schools. That is, whether a graduate school is a full institution or a part of a university. Colleges offer especially liberal arts and sciences programs with Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science as degrees. Usually these are four-year programs. Later also agricultural and mechanical arts colleges were added to the spectrum, also community colleges with two-year BA programs. A university offers a college or liberal arts science plus a graduate school and various professional schools, for example, law, medicine, music, or pedagogy. You take degrees such as Master of Arts, Master of Science, Master of Business Administration. Usually these are 1 to 2 year programs. There are also partly PhD programs which were imported from German-speaking Europe in the 1860s and started a trend towards research universities, and I'll come back to that later again. An important new development with gender implications started in the 1950s, that is during the Cold War climate. In order to compete with the Soviets, there was increasingly more funding, both private and public, for research and implementing research universities, which led to specific excellence and professionalization actions. Originally all male institutions, women could study from the mid-19th century on in private and public institutions. There were also women's colleges, especially on the East Coast, that I'll talk about shortly. A few numbers. In 1900, of the 1,000 colleges and universities, 71% were co-educative. In 2012, of the 4,500 institutions, 71 remained for men only and 51 for women only. There were also Black colleges catering specifically to African American students. There are today about 100 historical Black colleges and universities, many of which now have a non-Black student majorities. The number of undergraduates shows that in 1870, there were 21% female students. At the turn of the century, 37%. 1920 is the peak until 1950s with 47 female students, percent female students. In 1929, 38% of the graduate students were female. In 1949, the ratio dropped to 27% and was back to the level of the 1920s again in 1970. The first white women doing their PhDs was in the 1870s. The first African-American woman finished her PhD in 1921. By 1900, 228 women had done a PhD compared to over 2,000 men. And now it gets interesting. Since women who got a higher education mostly worked as teachers, most female students studied language and literature, especially English, history and social sciences, especially psychology. These disciplines, especially the liberal arts, increasingly became considered to be female, both in academic and social discourses. Also, between 1920 and 1950, female teachers in higher education made up about a third of all teachers. The rate again dropping by 1955 to only 22%, and only 13% were teaching in private institutions, which again shows that the 1950s was not a very favorable decade when it comes to women's emancipation. As mentioned before, as a Cold War measure, the implementing of research universities led to a growth in prestige, both in terms of higher salaries and social status, which had a negative effect on women, which is a common effect. The more prestige a field gets, the less likely women are admitted to it, and vice versa. The more popular a field becomes, the less attractive it seems to be becoming for men. What also happened was that more women's colleges closed, and they traditionally employed more women. Also, new tenure procedures now were strictly based on research and publication. But since women were mostly employed in colleges, they did less research and publications. They also had less prestigious positions with less opportunity for promotion. So this was the situation for women in higher education in the US in general. Now, moving closer to content-related issues and to American studies in particular, the first courses in US American literature were held in the 1870s. That was Princeton, for example, or the University of Michigan. Also, American literature was being taught as part of English language and literature departments, at least from the 1870s onwards. American literature, furthermore, was typically taught in women's colleges and on the East Coast, or young state colleges in the Midwest, but decidedly not in private male universities. And I'll say more about this gender gap shortly. In 1890, the first dissertations on US American literature were completed, including female PhD candidates such as Ella Knapp's with a study of Thoreau, University of Michigan in 1899. A side note, David Henry Thoreau being one of the major canonical American writers of the mid-19th century. I already mentioned that the development of American studies is strongly tied to that of English studies. New departments of national philologies, for example, German studies, Romance philology, had to compete against traditional humanities, which would encompass history, philosophy, law, theology, and only in the early 20th century could they assert themselves. In this sense, all the disciplines of modern languages have fairly recent histories compared to the stronghold of the classics, studying Greek literature, for example. Furthermore, besides disentangling American from English studies historically strongly favored language, that is, linguistics over literature. And also, American studies were thought to be just too easy to study, isolated even within the English departments, so that early Americanists had the feeling that a colonial pattern was at work here, British culture being considered superior to American. With all these various historical facts in mind, and I'll come back to some of them again, I turn to my case study, Women's Colleges and Mount Holyoke. So here you see two images of the campus. Mount Holyoke College today is a private liberal arts women's college in South Hadley, Massachusetts. It is the oldest member of the historical Seven Sisters colleges, a group of historically female colleges in the northeast of the US. And here you can see the list of the Seven Sisters, women's Ivy League, so to say. The Seven Sisters are 7 liberal arts colleges in the northeastern United States that are historically women's colleges. All were founded between 1837 and 1889, and each had a close tie to an all-male Ivy League school. So in this case, Mount Holyoke was tied to Dartmouth College or Wellesley College to Harvard. The name Seven Sisters is a reference to the Greek myth of the Pleiades, the seven daughters of the Titan Atlas and the sea nymph Pleione. Still today, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke College, Smith, and Wellesley College have decided against adopting co-education. In the case of Holyoke now, undergraduate admissions are restricted to female, transgender, and non-binary students. In 2014, Holyoke was the first member of the Seven Sisters to introduce an admissions policy that was inclusive to transgender students. However, all graduate programs are open to applicants regardless of gender. Now, very important is to realize that institutional histories can have other origins than the ones we are officially being taught. In my case, or rather the case of my discipline, it is noteworthy that the prehistory of the institutionalization of American studies leads us to educational practices that not only go back way before the early 20th century, that is the official institutionalization of the discipline, but it also leads us to particularly gendered practices. Indeed, American literature has its early home in women's seminaries, the forerunners of the women's colleges, and Mount Holyoke was both exemplary but also exceptional in that respect. Typical is the shifting between the old-style female seminary and the new research university model that came about in the course of the 19th century. A female seminary trained young women to become teachers, mostly for lower schools, but also for female seminaries themselves. All in all, one of the most culturally transformative historical changes of the 19th century was the rise of female education. There was, however, a double standard at work. Female education was thought a good thing, but in order to acquire accomplishments to embellish the home and the society of her husband, as you can still read from a quote taken from Thomas Woody's A History of Women's Education in the US of 1929. Of the fields of activity outside the home that gradually began to open for women, teaching emerged first. So women as teachers had two benefits according to the gender ideology of the time. Women were cheaper employees than men, and they were thought to be the natural nurturers of children. Catherine Beecher, and she's the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Catherine Beecher, a female educator herself, wrote, quote, "It is woman who is to come at this emergency and meet the demand, woman whom experience and testimony have shown to be the best, as well as the cheapest guardian and teacher of childhood, in the school as well as the nursery." And you can see this was taken from her essay, The Duty of the American Woman to Their Country of 1845. So this ideology was supported by many women at the time. Mount Holyoke Female Seminary opened in 1837 by Mary Lyon. And quickly the seminary's graduates spread across the country and even to other countries to teach and found other schools. Besides producing qualified teachers, there was a strong evangelical mission to the seminary. Women were expected to have a salvation experience while studying there. This lasted at least until the mid-1880s. And of course, this is in compliance with the overall ideology of womanhood at the time. So on the one hand, women were being provided serious education and the prospect of an independent teaching career, and this was radical. But on the other hand, this was done in a deeply religious and traditional manner, a manner that observed social conventions, ensuring that women did not compete with men, that is, following a strictly domestic ideology that claimed that women's role was to be a pious nurturer. To once more quote from Thomas Woody's 1929 History of Women's Education in the US, who critically viewed this gender ideology, quote, "Though much has been said and done to exalt the profession of teaching, it nevertheless remained true that it was one of the most lowly lonely, and unattractive means to a living. Probably only those who were filled with a missionary and philanthropic zeal for service came to love it. Here you see another picture of Holyoke and its geographical location. Here you can see senior students marching to the chapel. This is 1908. Mount Holyoke must be considered avant-garde at the time of its inception. But after the Civil War, things changed. There emerged a new national culture of higher education, and with that, female seminaries went into a crisis. Vassar, Smith, and Wellesley colleges, all women-only colleges, opened, and with these, the marketplace for female education dramatically changed. The seminary model now was outdated, inferior, and obsolete. So what was the difference? The shift from seminary to college is not only one of names and labels. After Vassar opened, the principal of Mount Holyoke, Julia Elizabeth Ward, wrote about the situation in 1872 when she was appointed as principal. Quote, Mount Holyoke was on the eve of a crisis in her history. Many persons, and among them some of our good friends, maintained that Mount Holyoke had no future, that she was to sink to the level of preparatory school, while other institutions were to do the higher educational work, for which the public was now clamoring. The 1880s brought debates over whether the institution should change its name, and this entailed a revisiting of old and new definitions of the seminary and the college. 50 years earlier, a college was thought unfeminine, solely considered to be for young men. Now, there was an urgent call for women's colleges. In 1888, Mount Holyoke received a new charter from the state of Massachusetts, becoming Mount Holyoke Seminary and College. Now, with that change, Mount Holyoke added 3 new collegiate courses that led to the crucial new degree credential. Before, they handed out certificates, not degrees. So they had a classical course for the Bachelor of Arts degree, a scientific course for the Bachelor of Science degree, and a literary course for the Bachelor of Literature. Already by 1891, the majority of applicants wanted to enter the collegiate department, and the traditional seminary course was eliminated. It had become thought of as inferior. With that, a new charter took hold. In 1893, Mount Holyoke was renamed into College, and this had the consequences, especially for women's educational careers. Now, Mount Holyoke increasingly placed pressure on teachers to professionalize. Like all women's colleges, they needed professionally trained women who did not exist yet. Hardly anyone had a degree then, and certainly not a PhD degree, which was still very new. A typical teacher at Mount Holyoke would teach, for example, mathematics, ancient history, modern history, natural theology, history of ancient literature. Now she would specialize in English literature and trying to get an MA degree at the University of Michigan, for example, to go on teaching at Mount Holyoke now as professor. Now, taking a specific look at how American literature figures in these changes and transitions, we can see that American literature emerged in the curriculum in 1887 as a seminary subject that was part of the school's commitment to lower-level teaching. This course was a second-year class offered under the rubric of English literature and served as an introduction to the advanced study of literature in English following the next 2 years. And this was common. American literature preceding English literature, indicating that American literature was seen as introductory, preliminary to the more serious, advanced, and difficult body of English literature. The next year, 1888, was the first year of the dual seminary and college charter, and both curricula require an American literature class, which can be seen as a sign that American literature was initially included in Mount Holyoke's vision of higher level education. A second class, an elective on our leading authors, was added in 1890. With the abolition of the seminary in 1893, this drastically changed. Alan Bowers, who had been teaching the American literature classes, left, and Alan Knapp came to run the English literature program. Unlike Bowers, she had a college degree, and she added 2 new American literature courses in 1893, one that required introductory course and one advanced course, offering a critical study of the principal writers of America. And yet, what she actually did was focusing on biographical and historical facts, that is, putting writers and their works into a historical context, but not analyzing and interpreting an actual text by these writers. Also, one didn't need to read whole books like novels, but excerpts for memorization and recitation, a sort of greatest hits for performing literature in public. Knapp then left Mount Holyoke to get a PhD at the University of Michigan in 1897, which she received writing a thesis on David Henry Thoreau. I already mentioned that. And she then went on as head of the English department at the Pennsylvania College for Women and other institutions, but always within the female education circuit. In this, Knapp's career was typical. Although highly qualified, her career, like those of other women, remained limited to the world of female schools. And then in 1897, Mount Holyoke suddenly dropped all American literature offerings. Why? What happened? First, the teaching of American literature was dependent on a particular teacher. With that teacher gone and replaced, things could always change, and they did. Second, Mount Holyoke was working hard to upgrade its collegiate status, that is, shedding its seminary past, and American literature was associated with the former pre-professional teachers' education. So when they left either for good or to get a degree, American literature courses went with them. Third, the 1890s was the decade of greatest institutional chaos in American higher education, and along came a new culture of English literature. In this case, the new head of the English literature was Margaret Sweet, a first PhD ever to be hired in Mount Holyoke for this section, and she made drastic changes. As her dissertation shows, the third class of weak verbs in primitive Teutonic, with a special reference to its development in Anglo-Saxon, there was a linguistic turn, which from then on dominated the English departments. Literature classes did not disappear, but American literature classes did. Sweet represented the new PhD model in higher education, striving for more research-based education. Along with that, American literature disappeared. American literature reappeared at Mount Holyoke sooner than in other institutions, however. And this has to do with Mount Holyoke giving itself a new identity, situating itself strategically between the old seminary and the new research university. This alternative was the women's college culture, along with Vassar College and others, and the new type of women's college teacher operated outside the circles of research prestige open to male teachers in other institutions. This gave the female teachers a marginal status, which allowed them a curricular openness to fields that were not part of the standard research program. And American literature was such a field. So the weakness on the one hand, namely being female teachers not being accepted in the patriarchal world of academia, turned out to be a stronghold on the other hand, namely their ability to operate outside traditional canonical structures. So what is interesting is that around 1900, it was the authority of the vast network from women's literary clubs to magazines speaking to primarily female audiences, as well as the significant presence of female teachers of American literature within the academy that helped to build an American canon. But soon, that is in the 1920s, a new generation of male professional scholars were to take over. And this is then where the official history of American studies begins, as we have heard. But at this earlier point, it was women who held authority of American literature. So in 1901, American literature was reintroduced at Mount Holyoke and remained there till 1928, an unusually early and consistent American literature course offering compared with those of other institutions. Again, this is not acknowledged in the official histories of American studies as a discipline. All in all, this was a double-edged success, however. American literature was a vital, energetic subject, much in demand by young female students in the world of women's colleges, but it remained marginal to the culture of research expertise. No male academic would do research in American literature to further his career. Private universities like Johns Hopkins University, for example, taught American literature in 1900 only at its teachers' college, again, because the subject did not qualify for advanced research and was shifted to that part of the institutions where most likely women studied to become teachers. So much for my case study. To wrap this up, looking at the time, I have a short clip, a promotional video that hails the benefits for women when studying at Mount Holyoke. So maybe we can have a short look at that before I come to my closing.
Any young woman today who is finishing high school and who wants to come into this world must come in herself as a pioneer. Not only is she entering a man's world, a world in which she must conquer in order to have a place, but she's entering a world that she must in some sense want to change.
I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer when I was 13, and I think that I chose a college based on what I thought a lawyer needed to know, which is how to debate.
When I was in high school, I was editor of the high school newspaper, and I knew that I liked to write. I knew that much, but I had no idea how that would affect itself in later life. I really thought if I go to a good college, Mount Holyoke was a good college, my parents would never yell at me again, ever.
Liberal Arts College is supposed to be the community of faculty and students, and both should be learning at the same time. And the faculty here are always researching, always producing. For example, we have 3 Pulitzer Prize winners. One of them very much involved right now in freshman tutorials. The other 2 involved in freshman, sophomore, junior, senior classes. They're not off in some research center removed from students, and they're not only concentrating on graduate students. They have been here for their entire careers almost, and their Pulitzer Prizes came out of work that they did here and shared with students through the years.
I've heard so many things from friends of mine.
Okay, I'll end with this male voice of authority. So this video was produced in the mid-1980s, so I'm sure it would be different today. So trying to wrap up and moving back to the general development of American studies and its gender implication. Around 1900, this was the so-called progressive era, where the US was very much engaged in reforms of all sorts, and especially women were active in the realms of economy and social life. There were also, there came, of course, the right to vote, which finally was granted in 1920. For American studies, this meant 3 things. The negative connotation that was attached to studying American literature before now turned into a call to study America as part of its new nationalist understanding. The intellectual elite now imagined a US that with and through literature could be defined. The progressive era had new notions of civilization and culture that led to a larger attention towards American literature. So the first graduate courses were being offered, and increasingly the offerings became interdisciplinary, including, besides literature, for example, economy and regional aspects. The First World War increased this interest, now with a specific aim of disentangling American history and culture from Anglo-Saxon traditions, and with a heightened focus on democracy. 1921, and with the founding of American Literature Group as part of the MLA, the Modern Language Association, this not only gathered a nationwide network, but it also marked an institutional starting point, which led to an American Studies movement, which envisioned a broad discipline encompassing culture, history, society, and politics of the US. So note, this is a move away from putting American literature at the center, as was the case before. This interdisciplinary approach was to bring the distinct American way of life to attention, and gradually it was possible to envision scholarly research on such topics before it was considered academic suicide. The specialization in things American also meant a drive to disengage from English language and literature and to view American studies as a separate discipline. And thirdly, however, these developments led to a homogenizing and concentration on specific themes within the emerging American studies. And this in turn excluded female and Black scholars, who, as we saw, were predominantly teaching at institutions not known for their research profile. Also, looking at the canon of American authors being taught, there were no women and Black writers. The canon consisted of writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, David Henry Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, or Henry James. Now, 2 points here on this period. The 1930s, and with the Great Depression and President Roosevelt's New Deal policy and World War II, the economic crisis of the 1930s and Roosevelt's state-subsidized system meant a decisive step towards left-wing ideas. American studies here was led by notions of American exceptionalism and the idealization of the common man. The discipline was anti-capitalist and anti-fascist, and as such, very innovative and reformist, even leaning towards radically Marxist ideas, and yet very nationalist, a combination that later was thought problematic and paradoxical, but at the time it was considered unproblematic. Later, many teachers of American studies were called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, including some women. Just before the war, American Studies was nationwide installed at all levels and sorts of universities, again, which had to do with notions of civilization and democracy with a special American bent. What is important here is that this is a period of institutionalization which went about more from the angle of teaching than from that of research. So far, there was still not a lot of research being done in American studies, although it had started. But by 1946, virtually every institution of higher education had courses in American literature. And contrary to earlier stage, now doing research on American literature was likened to being a heroic task, much like the early pioneers of the settler colonies had conquered the virgin land. I'm deliberately using this masculinist metaphors because this is how Americanists at the time understood themselves. To quote Ernest Lisi, an early protagonist of the American Studies movement, who wrote in 1940, American literature has proved to be the last big bonanza of literary scholarship. The harvest is ripe and the workers are not few. Until recently, the student of our literature was without honor, not alone abroad, but in his own country. His field lay fallow like scholars threshed the thinning straw of the 18th century. It extended to our scholars who spoke sneeringly of the kind of person who undertakes research in American literature. Obtuse as this condescension was, I do not complain of it. It was helpful. It made us careful. And it gave us the thrill of pioneers working in a new area. This construction of an Americanist was tied to ideas of an original, warrior-like man who fought against the traditional bastions of science, in contrast to the wild virginal land that he now could plow. American studies clearly had turned masculine. As Lefke-Hardus astutely concludes, the disciplinary memory, also that of American studies, has a gender. And with that, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. So yeah, thank you very much for this really super interesting presentation. I personally have learned quite a lot, but I'm sure there will be questions in the audience. So maybe we can just have, maybe can participants who have a question or want to raise a point for discussion, just raise their hand on Zoom. And then I give you the word in the order of seeing you. I think the first person I saw was Claire.
Yes, Ralph, thank you very much for this very rich overview of the history of American studies. I'll just begin with quite a general question. It seems that your talk tended to not limit, but identify American studies with American literature. And of course, it's more vast than that. So I was wondering about maybe other disciplines within American studies. What about American history, for example?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that I couldn't make that clear. So I would argue that, again, we have two histories. The official history of American studies is one that claims that American studies is an interdisciplinary field, much like you said yourself, that includes, amongst others, not only literature, but history, economy, art, and so on. But I would say that, and this is what I was trying to show, that American studies has a prehistory, and that prehistory pretty much focused on literature, if you want to claim it that. So again, you have, and I still would argue that with the institutionalization of American studies as we now understood it in a particular time in history had made that shift towards an understanding of the field that then was predominantly occupied by male researchers. But yes, again, to ascertain that American studies today, we think of the field as an interdisciplinary field. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions. Anyone who has a question? Renate, I can see your hand, so I just give you the word.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Ralph, for this very insightful talk. I have two American studies people at the center here, and it was very, very interesting. But some aspects of your story, let's say, I would recognize also from other disciplines, like, for example, that like there's a time when there was a lot of women, like for example, in computer sciences, there was also a time where there was like more women, and then now it's way more men, and was times when it was instrumentalized. So do you have is there any other disciplines where you see similarities with American studies regarding these specific aspects?
Precisely my point. You mentioned examples that I did allude to in passing, and that is of the more recent fields like the IT field and so on, that were from the starting point more prestigious and attracting more male, have become more popular, more women moving in a sense losing its sort of early prestigious status. So that those would be fairly new institutionalized professions or fields, disciplines, academic disciplines. I would say that with much of the, let me think. I think the history of women's education as being tied to the teaching profession, that probably would have the same history or prehistory in other countries, and then relating sort of to national disciplines. So I'm sure there is something fairly similar in Germany or German-speaking countries, which belongs to the prehistory of German studies, or compared even in countries that have the history of Romance languages and literatures. I do not have insights, and I do not know if those histories have been written so far, but I do think that there is a transfer possible, or at least I would entice other scholars to look at that history and look at how women figured before, and all those fields. The modern languages in particular were institutionalized in the early 20th century. And so what is it with the 19th century? Who was doing what? And I'm sure women played a crucial role there as well.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. Like, that's also very interesting. I think we have perhaps time for one or two more questions. So if there are any more questions, again, please just put up your hand.
There's a question in the chat, I think.
Okay, sorry, I have not seen that.
Okay.
Ralph, shall I read it out to everyone?
No, I'm reading it. I think that's a twofold question. I don't have an answer for the first one. I don't have information on teachers being recruited all the way to Argentina, although I don't know if that is a question. Women and gender studies. Well, that is a field, I would say, that has a different disciplinary history, precisely because the need to create departments of women's studies arose out of the liberatory movements of the 1960s and 70s. And that, of course, was precisely the work of women to make an effort in institutionalize those fields. Now, I don't know if that question triggers the question of whether sort of the broadening of scope and implementing gender studies, which again arose out of earlier women's studies programs, whether that encompasses more male participation. And the insinuation here is that perhaps the male authority takes over again. I don't know, but I think that would be an open question to discuss with all of the participants. I don't have a particular opinion there. I still would say the prestige of gender studies departments within universities is not of the highest prestige.
Which is actually something we have been talking about in the Civis Gender Studies Network, right? The different ways in which, yeah, we're not always have the highest regards of our universities. Excellent. Does anyone want to weigh in on this, or do we have any more questions? I see Lara has a question, so maybe we quickly give the word to you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for this amazing presentation. It was very insightful, and I also learned a lot. So I think it was very, very, very interesting what you said about how women are, of course, still today underrepresented in some areas and overrepresented in other areas, precisely in languages and liberal arts and everything. And I think this whole story in a way shows up a little bit, at least, or maybe it's my interpretation of that. But I think it was very interesting how in a way the pay decreased as women became the primary professionals in teaching and in languages. So I wanted to ask you if you think that it's really the case that once women entering a field in more numerous cases, that pay can actually then decrease in these cases, because we still live in a world, unfortunately, where women are paid less than men. And I think in research we're still debating the causes of these things. And I think this story, in a way, and please correct me if I read this wrong, but I think this story in a way shows that it's sometimes even that the pay follows which gender is dominate in an occupational field.
Sorry, to clarify that, you're particularly are asking about payment?
Yeah, payment, or more broadly prestige in a field, because sometimes I would say readily given answer is that, oh, women just choose fields that have been less prestigious in the first place. But I think when it comes to literature, this is in a way a little bit hinting at a possibility that sometimes as more women enter fields, prestige can decline afterwards.
I would agree. I would agree. If you move within the field, you lose sight of that, and you that's the way I feel it myself. It's a cozy niche within academia as literature people, but within the institutions, I would definitely say that there is certainly not a rise in prestige. And if you look at distributions of, starting with salaries, but also funds that are being distributed, certainly literature departments will not get the bulk of money. So that goes to other more prestigious and arguably more male departments. So I'm totally in agreement with what you're suggesting.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our session already, so I don't think we have time for any more questions. So I just want
in the chat, though.
Is there one?
Okay, let's see.
Antonio Tano.
Oh, yes.
Women teaching American studies.
Maybe we can answer that really quickly.
Examples. Oh, absolutely. There are numerous examples, and if you look at writers known today, starting with Toni Morrison and many others, they have been teaching in colleges. Some of them Black colleges, some of them women colleges. So absolutely, yeah, that. I think that should be 80s or 800. I don't know what 800 would be other than the 1980s. So yes, absolutely. Black women were very strong, and already then, no, I'm not saying already then. Yes, they were present and they were strong. Yes. Take the example of the video, for example. You had one Black woman there who moved on to be a lawyer, and she studied in Holyoke. And there are many examples like that. Yeah, like that. Yes, thank you for that question.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you very much again, Ralph, for the presentation and also for your answers to the question. And this will be the end of this lecture of the lecture series. So let me just end by saying that this is also the last lecture of the lecture series for this academic year. And we will start again in September, I believe. So there will be new posters and invitations distributed. And if you enjoyed today, do look out for that and have a look what we have in store for you in the next academic year. So thank you again, Ralph, and thank you also to the audience and of course to the organizers and in Rome and especially to Emil who took the registration for this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have
Bye
a good
bye.
evening.